Okay, so thank you again, everyone, for joining today. And my name is Tony Dubiel. I'm a product solutions architect for Ansible, covering North America public sector. Primarily, I focus on network automation. My background has been in networking, so a former Cisco employee for 12 years, triple CCIE, deployed a lot of networks, decided to make that step several years ago into automation. And my journey has taken me to Red Hat. I've been at Red Hat for 4 years now, and I'm a principal specialist solutions architect, again, covering Ansible from a tech sales perspective. And today, what we're going to talk about is the combination of using Ansible to automate Infoblox and also leveraging Infoblox as a source of truth for configuration management and inventory management of our Ansible system. So kind of using the collection in both ways, from a programmability standpoint and also from an inventory and configuration management standpoint. So for those of you that are new to Infoblox, just to get a quick poll, if you could give me a thumbs up if you have experience with Infoblox, and it's okay if you don't, I'm just trying to gauge where folks are. And the emojis are located at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so it looks like a good chunk of you are familiar with Infoblox, some aren't. So just a real quick level set. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but just from a high level, Infoblox, is a software solution that manages what we would call DDI. So that's DNS, DHCP, and IPAM. Primarily, my experience with Infoblox has been heavier on the IPAM side, mainly because I deal with network automation. So, leveraging the system to allocate host names and IP addresses for the network infrastructure, there's a lot of value in being able to integrate your automation directly into that source of truth. And that's a lot of what we'll see in the demo today. But when we look at the collection, you'll see that there's a lot more than that, right? So there's a lot of content that's focused on DNS and configuring DNS using Ansible as an option. So there's multiple ways of configuring Infoblox. You can do things as simple as the GUI or importing like CSV files or leveraging the API. And in this case, making the API easier to use from an abstraction that we call a collection of modules for Infoblox. So what we're looking at today is the NIAS collection, because the Infoblox that you'll see in my demonstration is like the on-premise implementation, not the cloud implementation, but there is a separate collection of modules for that as well. And I'll table that for a few minutes because we'll actually go in and take a look at these collections of modules and make sure that everybody's comfortable and familiar with how do you access, in this case, what you need in order to automate against Infoblox, right? So there's several different modules, and those modules are packaged together in a collection, and you need to have that available for you to use in your Ansible platform or from the Ansible command line to be able to run automation against the Infoblox. So before we do that, here's some of the main use cases. And today, my goal is to touch on each of these categories at a high level. Again, we don't have a lot of time to go in very deep dive into configuring DNS and other constructs, because this is primarily focused on network automation. A lot of the focus will be on the IPAM part of it. But in a similar way, you'd be able to automate to configure really any of those things. So configuring Infoblox, and as you look at where they are today with their collection of modules, it covers a lot of ground. So in addition to the IPAM, there's a lot more that you can configure. I will show you some sampling of configuring some zones and things on the DNS side. But again, most of this is going to lean more on the IPAM. And the reason for that is it kind of gives me that segue into the next bucket, configuring infrastructure. So in order to configure infrastructure as code with automation, the best practice is to establish your source of truth or source of truths up front for various categories of data that you need in order to create your configurations or configuration files that ultimately you'll use for your automation. So with IPAM in mind, two things, right off the bat, as you look into Infoblox that are very useful, is it gives me a source of truth to use for my inventory for automation. So with Ansible, we have to explicitly list out the groups and host devices that we want to run a particular automation against, or in this case, run a playbook against. And we can do that in a dynamic way by leveraging Infoblox as a source of truth for our devices and ultimately their host names and their IP addresses. We could extend that further into things as more pertinent to the configuration. So in other words, creating group and host vars as part of that inventory to include configuration management aspects for things such as VLANs. So, there's a way to extend that, configuration to leverage Infoblox, maybe not so much as a configuration management database for like all of your configs, but for certain components of the network infrastructure, we can provide that, on the front end through Infoblox, if that is the source of truth or the trusted, database that we have for that, particular information, especially around IP addresses and host names and things of that nature. Now, the second part of this is kind of a two-way street where we can leverage Infoblox to manage drift, or what we would call drift control, with our devices. So what drift is, if you're not familiar, is a circumstance that happens when the running configuration in a network device starts to drift away from what the source of truth is. So configurations start to drift, oftentimes because people make mistakes or a change is not properly documented back to the front end. So if I were to go into out-of-band through command line and make changes to a switch or a router, and if that's not represented with the truth, the source of truth in terms, in this case, leveraging Infoblox for IP addresses, I may have inaccurate IP addresses or networks that I'm using or have allocated into my device, or a switch. In this case, it could be the front end of this could be source of truth for the VLANs. So that's something that we can consider as well to make a check against, right? So check the IP addresses and the VLANs on the running config of the device against what the database in Infoblox states should be the source of truth. Now, if there's a difference, we can either, depending on what the situation is or what our policy is, we can update the front end on Infoblox. We can use Ansible to do that, to make it very easy to update that change, or we can still continue to use the GUI or import spreadsheets or whatever we want to do on that side to represent the change that was made out of band, because perhaps that was something that is valid in terms of change because it was a result of troubleshooting, right? So in that case, we would want to ingest that change and update the front end source of truth. In the opposite direction, we may have a change that's a mistake. So after review, we may want to override that configuration and now update it with what the source of truth states is the correct configuration. So we can easily verify configs. And in the demonstration, I'm going to show you examples of all three of this. So we're going to bring up an Infoblox configuration effectively from the ground up to give us some data to play with. And then we're going to use that data from a host perspective to populate an inventory, or what we call a dynamic inventory in Ansible. The dynamic part means that if we change something on the front end in Infoblox, if we remove a network, change a network, add a device, that would be updated in our inventory. So the next time that we go to run a playbook against the inventory, it would automatically be updated for us, as opposed to a static inventory that we would need to go into that source file, that text file or that YAML file, and manually make updates. So dynamic inventories are advantageous in large infrastructures or network infrastructures because we might have a large amount of change, and it's hard for us to reconcile that manually, right? So there's a huge benefit of an inventory source. Now keep in mind, you can have more than one inventory source too. So if Infoblox is the best choice for your host names and IP addresses because it is an IPAM solution, and also the front end for DNS or if you're using DHCP for your devices, which is probably highly unlikely for the network devices, more from a endpoint standpoint, we would always have that updated information. But you may have another system in play that has better view or has more precise configurations data that's for other configurations for these devices. So that could be something like a ServiceNow or a more purpose-built solution for source of truth for network infrastructure, like a NetBox. You can combine these sources together to create a single inventory with multiple sources. So we're not going to get into that today because that's a bit more complex, but we will spend some time understanding how to use a dynamic inventory, which I think, regardless if we're talking about Infoblox or something else, another network management tool or some other type of tool outside of Ansible, it's important to understand how we can leverage these inventory plugins and set them up. So having said that, I mentioned earlier that we're going to take a look, just a quick look at the actual collection of modules. So here's a summary of what we're dealing with today with Infoblox. So Infoblox has 35 modules. These would all be the action modules that would provide configurations to Infoblox, as opposed to lookup plugins. So think of lookup plugins are kind of the reverse direction. They provide us a bit of Python code. So typically these plugins are configured or developed in Python, and then we can call them in our playbook. So a playbook is just a YAML file, but when we create a variable, right, or we're creating a fact, then we can leverage these filters to allow us to extend what typically we can do in YAML into Python code using these plugins. So effectively, these plugins give us an easy way to search for specific information in Infoblox and make that data available in our playbooks. So if we set a fact, and that creates a variable that we can use in our task in our playbook, we can also leverage the ability to use plugins to maybe further manipulate that data. And the plugins allow the data to become very malleable and very easy to work with and very easy to parse or search through. And we'll see that in the examples. The third bullet here is the dynamic inventory plugin. So again, this is Infoblox. It does have some of its own specific configurations, but for the most part, you'll see that inventory plugins work effectively the same and have similar configurations and similar steps in order to set them up. So let's go ahead and take a look here. So this is the Galaxy site that you should be seeing. Yeah, I can see it on the little screen. Yeah, so this one here, again, this is infoblox.nios, right? Because that's what I'm running in my lab environment. But there's additional collections. Let's just go back a bit. The universal DDI is for the Infoblox in the cloud. So at first I was going to spin up one of these in AWS, but it was a bit harder to do with the licensing and subscription. So I'm using the on-prem because there's a 60-day eval. And a lot of my customers actually have the on-prem, Infoblox. So I felt that this one would hit, the broader swath of people more than the cloud version. But there's two of them. So when we double click into the Nios collection of modules, we can see in the contents, these are all of the modules, the 35 modules, right? So there's quite a bit. So what this is a wrapper around the API. So if you wanted to use the API directly to Infoblox, you can go to their webpage and they have, they've documented it very well, but you would have to create like individual API calls and work at a very low level in order to leverage that either with curl or Postman or using the URI module in Ansible. And that would be a lot of work. So really these modules are a wrapper around those APIs because you really don't have to interact with the APIs directly at all. It's all been abstracted for you. And all you're really doing is defining parameters. So as we scroll down, you can see these are all different types of configurations that you could have potentially configured from the GUI or leverage the API. We're just using Ansible to configure what we would have configured. So really the benefit of Ansible is you can create a workflow in your automation platform to step out the order that you want to configure your info blocks. And you can do that very rapidly, right? A lot quicker and a lot less work than trying to work with APIs one at a time, and light years faster than trying to do this stuff manually from the GUI. So we'll kind of table this because we'll take a look at some of the other specific modules in the demo portion. But just note that when you go to Galaxy, you can see all the modules, and you can actually click on them and see documentation and examples of each. But before we get too deep into those modules, I wanted to show you the inventory. So this is the inventory plugin, right? So when you click into the documentation here, it shows you parameters to set up the configuration file for that inventory plugin. So if you haven't done this before, don't worry, we're going to go through these steps in order, and we're going to build our own little configuration, and we're going to use my Infoblox as a source for the inventory. But I just want you to note that you can go to the documentation to see what parameters and how to configure them from here, or you can use the documentation site. So that's this one. And if you click up towards the top here, so here's like a listing of all the modules, and then you can just click into those for the specific module that you want to see the parameters and also the examples. Each one of these always has examples to give you an idea of how to use the parameters. And typically you're not using all of the parameters, you're using just the ones that you need. And anything that you're not using, when you run it in Ansible, you'll see those parameters as null because they weren't called when you invoked that module, but you can see the ones that were in there. So we talked about the inventory and the regular modules. The other piece of this is the lookup plugins. So let me go back to contents. So we have regular modules that map to like configurations. So we've got the inventory plugin, which is a specific type of module or plugin that we use for the inventory. And then we have these lookup plugins. So this is how we can look or glean specific information directly from Infoblox. So one of those is if we want to determine like what IPs are available to allocate. So that's a very popular lookup. And then we also have like the available networks, so we have, our blocks of networks for DHCP and an IPAM. And then we have like more generic lookup where we can query like any of those configuration objects that we're using from the regular modules. We can query for their configuration and be able to use that to read from the Infoblox and leverage it in Ansible. Because there could be some data that we want to use to compare against. So I mentioned that configuration drift. That's where we would use that type of lookup so that we can make a comparison to say, this is what Infoblox says the configuration is as our source of truth versus what's running on the device. So we can use that lookup with a combination of doing an assertion or an assert. So we can say, here's pass-fail criteria. If these things are not the same or not the specific value, then it either passes or it fails. And then lastly, I mentioned that Infoblox also covers VLANs. So we can look up the VLANs in this way. So I won't go too deep into how to use these yet because we'll see it in action in the demonstration. But just note that if you were to click, like if you go into any of these and click, it's just like the other modules where you see the parameters and then you see some examples of how to actually use them. And you can get to that from Galaxy site or from our documentation. So the docs.ansible.com. And then this specific, collection of modules, you just click on the ones that you want to look at, right? So just go into any of these. Here's one that I was looking at earlier for the host record. Same thing, parameters. Sometimes there's more parameters for a particular module than others. And then there's always examples of how to use them in a playbook. All right, so again, we'll come back to this in more detail. So the next thing is I have some examples for you to use as a follow-on. These playbook examples here on this GitHub are from Infoblox, and it's for a several different ways of using those modules. They provided a repo. So these are in the format of playbooks, right? So you can use them for the most part as is. It's just you have to set up your credentials and you or the provider in this case to be able to log into your Infoblox and do a little bit of setup on the front end. But for the most part, you can take these examples and run with them. The second link is the link to the repo for today. So I'll provide this as a PDF afterwards, and you'll be able to go to the Meetup site for Ansible4Networking, and you can grab these links here, and I'll also add them into the Ansible4Networking YouTube channel. So if you do go to the YouTube, please like and subscribe so I can get some more subscribers on that. It's all free and everything, but just to build that up, if you don't mind, and then you'll be able to pull it down from there. So this is more for your reference, but we will use all the code from today is in the second one, the demo repo.